The peace that settled over Ars Magna Academy in the months following the Festival of Stars was a fragile thing, like ice on a winter pond, beautiful to look at, but cracking under the slightest pressure. Jae-Hyun had learned to recognize the signs of that cracking long before anyone else. It was the system that alerted him, as it always did, its notifications appearing in the corner of his vision like warnings written in blood. Dimensional instability detected. Location: the abyssal rift, 500 meters beneath the Grand Hall. Threat level: Omega. Warning: the seal that held the Parasitic King for 1,000 years was never meant to contain the true enemy. It was a beacon, a signal, a doorbell. They are coming. He stood in the center of the Grand Hall, watching the reconstruction crews work on the final sections of the dome. The nobles had returned to their estates. The students had resumed their studies. The professors had gone back to their lectures, their research, their quiet lives of scholarship and routine. The world had moved on, as worlds always did, from the trauma that had nearly destroyed it. But Jae-Hyun had not moved on. He had been waiting, training, preparing, and now the waiting was over. Yoo-na found him there, as she always did, her footsteps silent on the newly laid stone, her presence a warmth at his back that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. She did not ask what was wrong. She had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the focus in his eyes, the way his monarch's blood seemed to pulse in time with something that only he could hear. "The system," she said. It was not a question. "The seal is failing," he replied. "Not the one we broke, a deeper one, older. The first monarch seal was never meant to be permanent. It was designed to buy time, to give us a chance to prepare for what was coming after." He turned to face her, and she saw the truth in his eyes, the truth he had been carrying since the moment they had emerged from the true hell mode, the truth that the first monarch had whispered to him in the final moments before the light had taken them. The Parasitic King was not the enemy. It was the guard dog, the thing that was chained to the door to keep people from looking too closely at what was behind it. And now that the guard dog is dead, the door is opening. Yoo-na's face went pale, but her voice did not waver. "What's behind the door?" Jae-Hyun looked down at his hands, at the scars that had faded but never completely disappeared, at the monarch's mark that pulsed beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. The first monarch called them the Watchers, beings that exist in the spaces between dimensions. They have been observing this world for 1,000 years, waiting for the seal to weaken, waiting for the moment when they could reach through and take what they wanted. He looked up and his eyes held the weight of everything the first monarch had told him, everything he had been carrying alone for 3 months, everything he had not wanted to burden Yoo-na with until he was certain. They are not like the Parasitic King. They do not consume. They do not destroy. They collect. Worlds are their specimen. Civilizations are their experiments. And we are the ones who caught their attention. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the fire that burned beneath it, the strength that had carried her through hell mode and made her something that the Watchers had never seen before. The first monarch did not just seal the Parasitic King. He made sure that when the Watchers finally looked at this world, they would see something that would make them hesitate. He made sure that they would see a world that had produced something that could fight back. He made sure that they would see us. Yoo-na stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something: doubt, fear, the shadow of the boy who had once been the weakest student in the academy. But she found none of those things. What she found was the same certainty that had been there since the beginning, the same unshakable belief that no matter what came, they would face it together. "Then we show them what they're afraid of," she said, and her voice was the voice of the Crimson Princess, the woman who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood and steel in her spine. "We show them that this world does not break. We show them that the people who live here do not bow. We show them that the F-rank who cleared hell mode is the most dangerous thing they have ever faced." She squeezed his hand, and he felt the fire that burned in her spread to him, warming the cold that had settled in his bones, lighting the darkness that had been gathering at the edges of his vision. "When do we go?" Jae-Hyun smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask that question for a very long time. Now. The descent into the abyssal rift was not like the catacombs. The catacombs had been old, forgotten, buried beneath centuries of stone and silence. But the rift was something else entirely. It was a wound in the world, a place where the fabric of reality had been torn open and never fully healed. The walls pulsed with a light that was not light. The air was thick with a pressure that made Jae-Hyun's monarch's blood sing, and in the distance, far below, something was moving. They had been descending for hours, following the tunnels that the first monarch had shown him in the final days of their training, the passages that led to the heart of the seal that had held the Parasitic King for 1,000 years. But the seal was gone now, shattered by Jae-Hyun's own hand, and in its place was something that should not exist. A door. It was massive, larger than the Grand Hall, larger than the Academy itself, its surface made of a material that seemed to shift between stone and light, and something that had no name in any language Jae-Hyun knew. And on its surface, carved in letters that burned with a cold, distant fire, was a message that had been waiting for 1,000 years for someone to read. The Watcher's seal, do not open. Warning. Beyond this door lies the space between dimensions. Beyond this door lies the true hell mode. Beyond this door lies the war that will determine the fate of every world that has ever existed. You have been warned. Jae-Hyun stood before the door, Yoo-na at his side, and felt the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on him. The first monarch had built this door. The first monarch had carved that warning. The first monarch had spent 1,000 years in chains, waiting for someone who could do what he could not. And now, Jae-Hyun was here, standing at the threshold of everything that had been waiting for him since the moment he was born. How do we open it? Yoo-na asked, her voice steady, her flames already beginning to flicker at her fingertips. Jae-Hyun raised his hand and the monarch's mark on his palm began to glow. We don't. It opens for us. It's been waiting for us. For me. For the one who carries the blood of the monarchs and the will of those who came before. He pressed his hand to the door, and the world exploded into light. The space beyond the door was not a place. It was an absence, a void, a nothingness that stretched in every direction, infinite and empty, without up or down, without light or dark, without time or distance. It was the space between dimensions, the place where worlds were born and died, where the laws of physics were suggestions and the only constant was change. And in that void, something was waiting. Jae-Hyun saw them as his eyes adjusted to the nothingness, as his monarch's senses reached out to touch the fabric of this place and make it his own. They were vast, the Watchers, so vast that his mind struggled to comprehend their scale. They had no forms that human eyes could perceive, no shapes that human language could describe. They were presences, concepts, ideas given weight and mass by the sheer force of their existence. And they were looking at him. Ah, a voice said, and it was not a voice, not really, but something that Jae-Hyun's mind translated into sound because it could not process the truth of what was speaking. The experiment has produced something interesting after all. The presence that had spoken moved closer, and Jae-Hyun felt its attention like a weight on his soul, a pressure that made his monarch's blood scream in his veins. We have been watching this world for 1,000 years, waiting to see what would emerge from the crucible we created. The parasite was a simple test, a way to weed out the weak, to cull the herd, to prepare the survivors for something greater. But you exceeded our expectations. Another presence moved, and another, until Jae-Hyun was surrounded by the Watchers, their attention fixed on him with a hunger that made the Parasitic King's appetite seem like the passing fancy of a spoiled child. You broke the seal, you absorbed the parasite's power, you walked through the true hell mode and emerged transformed. You have become something that we have never seen before in all the worlds we have collected, a mortal who carries the power of a monarch, a creature of hope and will, and the stubborn refusal to accept the limits that were placed upon you. The first presence moved closer still, and Jae-Hyun could see it now, not with his eyes but with something deeper, something that had been awakened in the depths of hell mode. It was beautiful, in the way that a supernova was beautiful, in the way that the extinction of a species was beautiful, in the way that the end of all things was beautiful. It was the beauty of something that had existed since before the first star was born, that would exist long after the last star died, that had seen worlds rise and fall and rise again, and thought nothing of it. You are an anomaly, Kang Jae-Hyun, an aberration, a flaw in the design of this universe that should not exist. And we have spent 1,000 years waiting for you. The Watcher reached out and Jae-Hyun felt something touch his soul, something cold and ancient and patient beyond comprehension. We are going to take you apart piece by piece and learn everything there is to know about you. We are going to study you, dissect you, understand you in ways that no creature has ever been understood. And when we are done, we are going to put you back together and see what happened. Because that is what we do. That is what we have always done. We collect, we experiment, we learn. Jae-Hyun felt the cold spreading through, the Watcher's presence reaching for the core of his being, for the monarch's power that burned in his blood, for the will that had carried him through hell mode and the trials and everything else that had been thrown at him. It was going to take everything from him. It was going to break him down and rebuild him and make him something that even he did not recognize. But he had been broken before. He had been broken and rebuilt and broken again until there was nothing left but the will to survive. And that will was the one thing that the Watchers had not accounted for. No, he said, and his voice was not his own. It was the voice of the first monarch who had waited 1,000 years for this moment. It was the voice of Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone because he did not know how to trust. It was the voice of every student who had been harvested, every professor who had been corrupted, every innocent person who had been caught in a war they did not even know existed. It was the voice of a world that refused to break. The Watcher recoiled, its attention withdrawing from his soul, its presence flickering with something that might have been surprise or might have been fear. Behind him, Jae-Hyun felt Yoo-na's flames erupt, felt the fire that burned in her blood reach out to touch the void and make it burn. He felt the presence of the academy above them, the students and professors and survivors who had rebuilt their world from the ashes of the directorate's corruption. He felt the presence of the first monarch. His vigil finally ended. His legacy finally passed on to someone who could carry it. He felt the presence of 1,000 years of hope, of courage, of the refusal to let the darkness win. And he held it in his hands like a weapon, like a shield, like the only thing that had ever mattered. You have been watching this world for 1,000 years, he said, and his voice was the voice of a monarch now, certain and calm, carrying the weight of everything that had come before and everything that would come after. You have been testing us, studying us, waiting to see what we would become. And now you know. We are the ones who do not break. We are the ones who do not bow. We are the ones who look at the darkness between the stars and see not something to fear, but something to fight. He raised his hand, and the monarch's power flowed through him like a river, like an ocean, like the fire that was burning in Yoo-na's veins, and the hope that was burning in the hearts of everyone who had survived the Festival of Stars. You want to take us apart. You want to study us and learn our secrets. Then come. We will show you what happens when you try to consume a world that has learned to fight back. The Watchers moved, and the void trembled, and the war that had been waiting for 1,000 years finally began. Yoo-na's flames were the first to strike. They erupted from her hands like the birth of a star, a column of silver fire that cut through the void and struck the nearest Watcher with the force of a supernova. The creature screamed, a sound that was not pain but something else. Something that might have been surprise or might have been delight, and its form began to shift, to change, to become something that Jae-Hyun's mind could finally comprehend. It was a face, a vast face carved from the darkness between stars, its eyes burning with the light of 1,000 dying suns, its mouth opening wide enough to swallow worlds. It looked at Yoo-na and it smiled. The fire-bearer, it said, and its voice was the sound of galaxies colliding. The one who walked into hell beside the monarch and emerged transformed. You are almost as interesting as he is. Almost. It reached for her, its hand made of shadow and starlight, its fingers longer than mountain, its palm wide enough to hold the academy and everything in it. Yoo-na did not run. She raised her hands and her flames became a wall, a barrier, a shield that held the Watcher's hand at bay, that burned the shadow and scattered the starlight, that made the creature hesitate for the first time in its eternal existence. You are strong, the Watcher said, and there was something in its voice that might have been respect. Stronger than any mortal we have ever encountered, but strength is not enough. It was never enough. The first monarch was stronger than the 7 who came before him were stronger than all of us, and still they fell, still they failed, still they could not stop what was coming. It pressed harder, and Yoo-na's flames began to flicker, to dim, to retreat before the weight of the Watcher's power. She was strong, yes, stronger than any student in the academy, stronger than any mage the world had produced in 1,000 years. But she was facing something that had existed since before the first star was born, something that had collected worlds and civilizations and species beyond counting, something that had never been defeated and never would be. She was going to fall. Jae-Hyun could see it in the way her flames were dying, in the way her arms were trembling, in the way her face was pale with the effort of holding back something that should not be held back. She was going to fall, and when she fell, the Watcher would take her, and he would be alone, and the darkness would win. But he had been alone before. He had been alone in hell mode, alone in the catacombs, alone in the darkness that had tried to consume him since the day he was born, and he had learned in that loneliness that being alone did not mean being weak. It meant being free, free to make choices that no one else would make, free to take risks that no one else would take, free to become something that no one else would become. He reached out, not with his power, not with his monarch's blood, but with something deeper, something that had been growing in him since the moment he first walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose, something that the Watchers had never seen before, because they had never faced anyone like him. His will. It was not a power that could be measured or ranked or understood. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that there were limits to what he could do, that there were things that could not be overcome, that there was a point beyond which even hope could not reach. It was the will of a boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided that he would rather die than believe. And that will, that impossible, ridiculous, magnificent will, reached out and touched the Watcher that was trying to consume Yoo-na, and it burned. The Watcher screamed, not the scream of surprise or delight that it had shown before, but the scream of something that was experiencing pain for the first time in its eternal existence. Its form began to collapse, to crumble, to fall apart, the shadow and starlight that made up its body scattering into the void like dust in a hurricane. "What are you?" it screamed, and its voice was the voice of something that was afraid. "What have you become?" Jae-Hyun stepped forward, his monarch's crown blazing above his head, his eyes burning with a light that was not the light of the sun or the stars or any of the lights that had ever existed in this universe. It was the light of a world that had refused to break, of a species that had refused to bow, of a boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided to become everything. "I am King Jae-Hyun," he said, and his voice was the voice of a monarch, the voice of a man who had walked through hell and returned with the power to remake the world. "I am the F-rank who cleared hell mode. I am the weakest student in the history of Ars Magna Academy. I am the one who was sealed at birth, who was humiliated for 3 years, who was sent into a dungeon to die because I had nothing left to lose." He raised his hand, and the light that was burning in him began to spread, reaching out to touch the Watchers that surrounded him, to push back the darkness that had been gathering for 1,000 years, to show them what it meant to face a world that had finally found something worth fighting for. "And I am the one who is going to show you what happens when you try to consume a species that has learned to hope." The light exploded, and the void screamed, and the war that had been waiting for 1,000 years finally began in earnest. When Jae-Hyun opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of the grand hall, the morning sun streaming through the newly rebuilt dome, the sound of birds singing in the courtyard outside. Yoo-na was beside him, her hand in his, her breathing steady and slow. They were alive. They were home. The battle was over. For now. He sat up slowly, his body aching, his monarch's blood still pulsing with the echoes of the power he had unleashed. The system was silent, its notifications absent for the first time since he had emerged from hell mode, but he knew it was not gone. It was waiting, watching, preparing for the next battle, the next trial, the next impossible thing that he would have to do to survive. Yoo-na stirred beside him, her eyes opening, her hand tightening on his. "Did we win?" Jae-Hyun looked at the morning sun, at the world that was healing, at the future that was waiting for them. He thought about the Watchers, about the void, about the war that was only beginning. He thought about the first monarch who had waited 1,000 years for this moment. He thought about Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone because he did not know how to trust. He thought about everyone who had been lost, everyone who had been sacrificed, everyone who had believed that someday someone would come who was strong enough to fight the darkness. He thought about himself, King Jae-Hyun, the F-rank, the failure, the boy who had walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose and walked out with the power to change the world. "We won today," he said, and his voice was steady, certain, the voice of a man who had faced the end of everything and found it wanting. "Tomorrow we will win again, and the day after that and the day after that for as long as it takes, because that's what we do. We fight, we survive, we win." Yoo-na smiled, and it was the smile of the Crimson Princess, the woman who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood and steel in her spine. "Together." Jae-Hyun smiled back. "Together." The sun rose higher over Ars Magna Academy, over the world that was healing, over the darkness that was waiting. And Kang Jae-Hyun, the weakest student in the history of the academy, the F-rank who had cleared hell mode, the monarch who had returned from the dead to save a world that had forgotten him, stood in the light and watched the new day begin. The war was not over. It would never be over. There would always be another enemy, another trial, another darkness waiting to consume everything he loved. But he was not afraid. He had walked through hell and come back. He had faced the end of the world and refused to blink. He had become something that the darkness had never seen before, something that it could never understand, something that it would never, ever defeat. He was Kang Jae-Hyun. He was the weakest student in the academy. He was the monarch who had cleared hell mode. And he was just getting started. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the void, and Jae-Hyun had learned to recognize the silence of the Watchers for what it was. Not retreat, but recalibration. The system had been dormant since that day, its interface dark, its notifications absent, but Jae-Hyun could feel it still, a presence at the edge of his consciousness, a weight in his blood that had not been there before the battle. The Watchers had touched something in him, something that the first monarch had not prepared him for, something that was only now beginning to awaken. He stood in the training yard at dawn, his body moving through the forms that the first monarch had taught him, his monarch's blood pulsing in time with the rising sun. Around him, the academy was waking, students streaming toward the dining hall, professors heading to their lectures, the ordinary rhythm of life that had returned to Ars Magna in the months since the Festival of Stars. They did not know about the Watchers. They did not know about the void. They did not know that the world had nearly ended 3 weeks ago, and that it would end again, and again, until someone finally found a way to stop it. Jae-Hyun wished he could be like them. He wished he could forget what he had seen, what he had become, what he was going to have to do. But the monarch's blood did not allow forgetting. It demanded that he remember. It demanded that he be ready. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Yoo-na's voice came from behind him, and he did not need to turn to know that she was watching him with that same mixture of concern and exasperation that had become her default expression since their return from the void. She had changed too, in ways that went deeper than the silver streaks in her hair or the new edge to her flame. She had seen the Watchers. She had felt their power, and she had not broken. She never broke. "I'm preparing," Jae-Hyun said, completing the form and lowering his hands. "The Watchers are not going to wait for us to be ready. They're going to come when we least expect it, when we're weakest, when we've let our guard down. That's what they do. That's what they've always done." He turned to face her, and she was standing at the edge of the training yard, her arms crossed, her crimson and silver hair catching the morning light. She was beautiful, in the way that a blade was beautiful, in the way that a fire was beautiful, in the way that something that had been forged in the heart of a crucible and emerged unbroken was beautiful. "You don't know that," she said. "You don't know what they're going to do. None of us do. That's the point. We're dealing with things that have existed since before the first star was born. We can't predict them. We can't outthink them. We can only react." She walked toward him, her footsteps steady on the worn stone of the training yard. "You've been out here every morning since we came back. You've been pushing yourself harder than you did in hell mode. You've been preparing for a war that you don't know how to fight, against an enemy that you don't understand, and you've been doing it alone." She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her flames, the fire that burned in her blood and would never go out. "You're not alone, Jae-Hyun. You've never been alone. Not since the day I took your hand in that storage room and promised to stand beside you." Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the determination that had carried her through hell mode and the void and everything else that had been thrown at them. And for a moment, just a moment, he let himself feel something other than the weight of what was coming. "I know," he said. "I know I'm not alone, but that's why I have to be ready, Because if I fall, you fall with me. If I break, you break with me. And I can't let that happen. I can't let them take you. Not you, not anyone else. Yoo-na reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his skin, her grip steady and sure. Then don't fall. Don't break. Be the monarch that the first monarch believed you could be. Be the one who walked into hell mode and came back with the power to change the world. Be Kang Jae-Hyun. That's enough. That's always been enough. She squeezed his hand, and for a moment, the weight that had been pressing on his chest since the battle in the void seemed to lift. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And as long as Yoo-na was beside him, as long as the fire burned in her blood and the steel in her spine, he would never be alone. He smiled, and it was the first real smile he had worn in 3 weeks. When did you get so wise? She grinned, and for a moment she was not the Crimson Princess, the warrior who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood. She was just a girl, standing in the morning light, holding the hand of a boy who had saved her life and she his, more times than either of them could count. I've always been wise. You just never noticed because you were too busy being dramatic. He laughed, and the sound of it echoed across the training yard, startling a flock of birds from the trees, drawing the attention of the students who were beginning to gather for their morning classes. They looked at him, at the F-rank who had become a monarch, at the weakest student in the academy who had saved them all, and they saw something that they had never seen before. They saw a boy who was learning to be happy. The message came that afternoon, delivered by a student Jae-Hyun did not recognize, a thin girl with pale hair and eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. She found him in the library, where he had been studying the first monarch's journals, searching for any mention of the Watchers that he might have missed. You are Kang Jae-Hyun, she said, and her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of someone who was speaking words that had been placed in her mouth by another. The anomaly, the aberration, the one who broke the experiment. Jae-Hyun's monarch's blood flared, his hand moving to the blade that he carried now, always, the blade that the first monarch had forged for him in the depths of the true hell mode. Who are you? The girl smiled, and it was not her smile. It was the smile of something that was looking through her eyes, speaking with her mouth, using her body as a vessel for a message that had been waiting to be delivered. I am a collector, she said, and her voice was the voice of the Watchers, the same voice that had spoken to him in the void, the same voice that had tried to consume him and Yoo-na and everything they had fought to protect. I am the one who watches the Watchers. I am the one who collects the collectors, and I have come to offer you a choice. Jae-Hyun's hand tightened on his blade, but he did not draw it. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was facing. What kind of choice? The collector stepped closer, and the girl's body moved with a grace that was not her own, her pale hair floating around her face like the tendrils of a deep-sea creature, her eyes reflecting a light that was not the light of the library or the sun, or any of the lights that had ever existed in this world. The Watchers are afraid of you, the collector said, and there was something in her voice that might have been admiration or might have been hunger. They have been collecting worlds for 1 billion years, and they have never encountered anything like you, a mortal who carries the power of a monarch, a creature of hope and will and the stubborn refusal to accept the limits that were placed upon you. You are an anomaly, an aberration, a flaw in the design of this universe that should not exist. She reached out and her fingers brushed Jae-Hyun's cheek, cold as ice, cold as the void, cold as the space between stars. They want to destroy you. They want to take you apart and study you and learn everything there is to know about you. But I am not like them. I do not destroy what I collect. I preserve. I protect. I keep. She smiled, and it was the smile of something that had been waiting for this moment since before the first monarch was born. Join me, Kang Jae-Hyun. Become part of my collection. Let me preserve you, protect you, keep you safe from the Watchers and the wars and the endless hunger that consumes everything it touches. You will never have to fight again. You will never have to fear again. You will never have to lose anyone you love again. Her hand moved from his cheek to his chest, her fingers pressing against the place where his monarch's mark burned beneath his skin. All you have to do is give yourself to me. All you have to do is let me collect you. Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the collector who wore the body of a girl he did not know, at the ancient thing that was speaking through her eyes, and he felt something that surprised him. Not fear, not anger, not the cold, calculating focus that had carried him through hell mode and the trials and everything else that had been thrown at him. "Pity, you don't understand," he said, and his voice was gentle, almost kind, the voice of someone who was about to tell a truth that the other did not want to hear. "I've been collected before. The directorate collected me. They put a seal on my birth, made me an F-rank, made me nothing. They collected me because they thought I was weak, because they thought I was worthless, because they thought they could use me and discard me, and no one would ever notice." He reached up and took her hand, the collector's hand, the cold fingers that had touched his face and his chest and his soul, and he held it in his own. "But I was not weak. I was not worthless. And someone noticed. Someone always notices." He released her hand and stepped back, and the monarch's mark on his chest blazed with a light that drove back the cold, that pushed back the darkness, that showed the collector what it meant to face a world that had finally learned to fight back. "I am not going to be collected," he said. "I am not going to be preserved or protected or kept. I am going to fight. I am going to fight the Watchers and the Collectors and anything else that tries to take this world. I am going to fight because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. That is what I will always do." He raised his hand, and the blade that the first monarch had forged for him was in it, its edge gleaming with a light that was not the light of the sun or the stars or any of the lights that had ever existed in this world. It was the light of a monarch who had walked through hell and returned with the power to remake the world. "And if you try to stop me," he said, "I will fight you too." The collector stared at him for a long moment, her pale eyes unreadable, her borrowed face frozen in an expression that might have been surprise or might have been delight. And then, slowly, she smiled. "You are magnificent," she said, and her voice was the voice of something that had seen stars born and die, that had watched worlds rise and fall, that had collected civilizations and species and wonders beyond counting. "I have been collecting for 1 billion years, and I have never seen anything like you. You are not an anomaly. You are not an aberration. You are something new, something that has never existed before, something that should not exist and yet does." She stepped back, her form beginning to fade, the girl's body collapsing as the collector withdrew from it, returning to the void from which it had come. "The Watchers will come for you. They will come with armies and weapons and powers that you cannot imagine. They will come because you frighten them, because you threaten everything they have built, because you are the one thing they have never been able to collect." She was almost gone now, her voice fading, her form dissolving into the light that was streaming through the library's windows. "But I will be watching, Kang Jae-Hyun. I will be watching to see what you become. And when you have won, if you win, I will be there, waiting, ready to collect the one thing that no collector has ever been able to take." And then she was gone, and the girl who had carried her fell to the floor, unconscious, her breathing shallow, her face pale. Jae-Hyun caught her before she could hit the ground, lowering her gently to the floor, checking her pulse, her pupils, the signs of the possession that had taken her. She would live. The collector had not harmed her. It had only used her, worn her like a garment, discarded her when she was no longer needed. It was what collectors did. It was what they had always done. Jae-Hyun looked at the girl's face, at the innocence there, at the life that had been interrupted by forces she could not understand, and he felt the weight of what was coming settle on his shoulders again. The Watchers were coming. The collectors were watching, and he was the only one who could stop them. He was the monarch. He was the one who had cleared hell mode. He was the weakest student in the academy who had become the strongest thing the world had ever produced. And he was afraid. Yoo-na found him in the library an hour later, sitting beside the girl's sleeping form, his blade across his knees, his eyes fixed on the window where the collector had disappeared. She did not ask what had happened. She could see it in his face, in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his hands were gripping the hilt of his blade like a lifeline. "She came through a student," he said, not looking at her, "wore her like a mask, used her to deliver a message, and then she left and the girl fell and I couldn't do anything to stop it." He looked at Yoo-na and she saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that had been there since the beginning, since the day he had walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose. What happens when they come through someone we know, someone we care about? What happens when they wear Yoo-na's face, or Professor Min's, or one of the students who survived the festival? What happens when I have to fight someone I love? Yoo-na knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her, to see her, to know that she was real, that she was here, that she was not going to let the darkness take her. "You fight," she said, and her voice was fierce, sir. The voice of the woman who had stood beside him in hell mode and the void and everything else that had been thrown at them. "You fight because that's what you do. You fight because you know that the person wearing my face is not me. You fight because you know that the only way to save me is to win. And you fight because you are Kang Jae-Hyun, and you have never lost a battle that mattered." She pressed her forehead against his, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the fire that burned in her blood, the love that had grown between them in the darkness and the light and everything that had come before. "You will not lose me," she whispered, "not to the Watchers, not to the Collectors, not to anyone, because I will not let them take me. I will burn them before I let them touch me. I will burn them all." Jae-Hyun closed his eyes, and for a moment he let himself believe her. He let himself believe that they could win, that they could survive, that they could be the ones who finally broke the cycle that had been repeating itself for 1 billion years. He opened his eyes and he looked at her and he smiled. "Together." She smiled back. "Together." The war did not come the next day, or the day after, or the week after that. The Watchers were patient. They had waited 1,000 years for the seal to break. They could wait a little longer for the anomaly to show them what he was capable of. But Jae-Hyun did not wait. He trained. He studied. He prepared. He gathered allies from the survivors of the festival, from the students who had seen the darkness and refused to run, from the professors who had been blind and were now desperate to atone for their blindness. He built an army, not of soldiers, but of mages, warriors, scholars, anyone who was willing to fight for a world that had almost been consumed by forces they did not understand. And at the center of it all, watching him, waiting for him, was the Collector. She did not come to him again. She did not need to. He could feel her presence at the edge of his consciousness, a weight in the void, a gaze that was always fixed on him, always watching, always waiting for the moment when he would slip, when he would break, when he would become something that could finally be collected. He did not slip. He did not break. He became something that the Collector had never seen before, something that should not exist, something that was going to change the world. He became a monarch. The night before the Watchers' first assault, Jae-Hyun stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea, the same cliffs where he had trained in the days before the festival, before the void, before everything had changed. The stars were bright above him, brighter than they had ever been, and he knew that among those stars there were eyes watching him, waiting for him, preparing to end him. Yoo-na stood beside him, her hand in his, her flames flickering at her fingertips, her presence a warmth against the cold that was coming. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had said everything that needed to be said in the training yard and the library and the storage room where it had all begun. They were ready. They had always been ready. "The stars are beautiful tonight," Yoo-na said, and her voice was soft, almost sad. "I used to look at them when I was a child and wonder what was out there. I used to dream of exploring them, of seeing things that no one had ever seen, of being the first to touch the light that had been traveling for 1 billion years to reach my eyes." She looked at him, and her smile was the smile of someone who had learned that dreams were not always what they seemed. "I never imagined that the stars were watching back. I never imagined that they were waiting. I never imagined that they were hungry." Jae-Hyun squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the fire that burned in her blood, the love that had grown between them in the darkness and the light. "Neither did I, but that's what we're fighting for. The dreams, the wonder, the belief that there is something out there worth seeing, worth exploring, worth protecting. The Watchers have been collecting worlds for 1 billion years because they have forgotten what it feels like to dream. They have forgotten what it feels like to hope. They have forgotten what it feels like to be human." He looked up at the stars, at the eyes that were watching him, at the hunger that was waiting to consume everything he loved. "We are going to remind them." Yoo-na leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment they stood together, two people who had walked through hell and come back with the power to change the world, watching the stars that were about to try to take everything from them. "When does it begin?" she asked. Jae-Hyun felt the system stir in his blood, felt the monarch's mark pulse on his chest, felt the weight of 1 billion years of waiting pressing down on him. He looked at the horizon, at the darkness that was gathering, at the army that was even now beginning to cross the void between worlds. "It begins now," he said. And the stars went out. The darkness that swallowed the stars was not empty. Jae-Hyun had known it would come. He had been preparing for it since the moment the collector had spoken to him in the library, since the Watchers had first touched his soul in the void, since the day he had walked out of hell mode with the power of a monarch burning in his blood. But knowing and facing were two different things. And as the light of 1,000,000,000 stars died in the sky above Ars Magna, he felt the weight of what was coming settle into his bones like a cold would never leave. The students in the courtyard screamed. The professors ran to the walls, their spells already forming, their faces pale with a fear that they had not felt since the Festival of Stars. They had thought the nightmare was over. They had thought the darkness had been defeated. They had thought that the F-rank who had saved them would be enough to keep them safe. They had been wrong. Yoo-na's flames erupted beside him, a pillar of silver fire that shot toward the sky, pushing back the darkness, giving light to a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly blind. Her face was set in the same fierce determination that had carried her through hell mode and the void, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at his own heart. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady, her hand already reaching for the blade that she carried now, always, the blade that had been forged in the true hell mode to cut through the darkness between worlds. Jae-Hyun's monarch's senses reached out, touching the void, counting the presences that were even now crossing the barrier between dimensions. There were dozens of them, hundreds, more than he could count, more than he had ever imagined, more than the first monarch had prepared him for. "Too many," he said, "but that's never stopped us before." He raised his hand, and the blade that the first monarch had forged for him was in it, its edge gleaming with a light that was not the light of the sun or the stars, but something older, something that had been waiting in the blood of the monarchs since the first of them had looked at the darkness and said, "No more." "The Watchers are coming," he said, and his voice carried across the courtyard, across the academy, across the world that was about to be tested. "They have been coming for 1,000 years. They have been waiting for this moment since before the first star was born. They think we are weak. They think we are nothing. They think that we will break." He turned to face the students who had gathered around him, the survivors of the festival, the warriors who had trained beside him in the months since the void, the ordinary people who had chosen to fight because they had no other choice. He saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt, the desperate hope that someone would save them, that someone would be strong enough to do what they could not. He saw himself in their faces, the boy who had been nothing, the boy who had walked into hell because he had nothing left to lose, the boy who had become something that no one had ever expected. "They are wrong," he said, and his voice was the voice of a monarch now, certain and calm, carrying the weight of everything that had come before and everything that would come after. "We are not weak. We are not nothing. We will not break. We are the ones who survived the festival. We are the ones who rebuilt this academy from the ashes of the directorate's corruption. We are the ones who looked at the darkness and said, 'No more.'" He raised his blade, and the light that was burning in him spread to the students around him, to the professors on the walls, to the world that was waiting for someone to lead it into the darkness. "Tonight, we show them what happens when you try to collect a world that has learned to fight back. Tonight, we show them that the weakest student in the academy is the most dangerous thing they have ever faced. Tonight, we win." The light exploded from his blade, a wave of silver fire that swept across the courtyard, across the academy, across the world, pushing back the darkness, giving light to the army that was even now gathering at the gates of Ars Magna. And in the light, Jae-Hyun saw them. The Watchers had taken form for this battle, not the vast, incomprehensible shapes that had existed in the void, but something smaller, something that human minds could comprehend, something that could be fought and killed and driven back. They were tall, taller than any human, their bodies made of shadow and starlight, their faces blank, their eyes burning with the cold, distant light of dying stars. They carried weapons that were not weapons, tools that had been designed to collect worlds and civilizations and species beyond counting, and they were pointing them at the academy that had dared to resist them. At their head, standing at the front of the army, was a figure that Jae-Hyun recognized. It was the collector, but not the collector who had worn the face of a girl in the library. This was something older, something that had been waiting for this moment since before the first monarch was born. Her form was vast, larger than the others. her body a shifting mass of shadow and light that seemed to drink the darkness and the fire in equal measure. Her face was not a face, but a suggestion of a face, a memory of a face, the echo of something that had once been human before it had become something else. And she was smiling. "Kang Jae-Hyun," she said, and her voice was the voice of the void, the voice of the space between stars, the voice of something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "I told you I would be watching. I told you I would be waiting. I told you that when you had won, if you won, I would be there to collect you." She raised her hand, and the army behind her surged forward, a wave of shadow and starlight that swept toward the gates of Ars Magna like the tide rising to swallow the shore. "Show me what you have become." The first wave hit the walls of the academy like a hammer striking an anvil. Jae-Hyun had prepared for this. He had spent 3 months in the true hell mode learning to fight the Watcher's servants, the creatures that they sent ahead of them to soften their targets, to test their defenses, to find the weaknesses that could be exploited. He had trained his students to recognize them, to fight them, to kill them. He had built walls that were not just stone and magic, but will and hope and the stubborn refusal to accept that there were limits to what they could do. But preparation and reality were two different things, and as the first wave of shadow creatures struck the walls, Jae-Hyun felt the ground shake beneath his feet and knew that some of his students would not survive the night. He moved before he could think, his body responding to the threat with the same instinct that had carried him through hell mode and the void. His blade cut through the first creature that reached him, a thing of shadow and hunger that dissolved into nothing as the monarch's light touched it. He moved to the next, and the next, and the next, his blade a blur of silver fire, his body a weapon that had been forged in the heart of a crucible that should have killed him 100 times over. Around him, his students were fighting. He saw them in the light of Yoo-na's flame, the survivors of the festival who had chosen to stand beside him, the professors who had been blind and were now desperate to atone, the ordinary people who had looked at the darkness and decided that they would rather die than let it win. They were not soldiers, they were not warriors, they were bakers and farmers and scholars who had never held a weapon before the festival of stars. But they were fighting, they were standing, they were proving that the Watchers had been wrong about them. Yoo-na was at the center of it all, her flames consuming everything they touched, her blade cutting through the shadow creatures like a scythe through wheat. She was beautiful, in the way that a wildfire was beautiful, in the way that a storm was beautiful, in the way that something that had been forged in the heart of a crucible and emerged unbroken was beautiful. She was the Crimson Princess, the woman who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood and steel in her spine, and she was unstoppable. But there were too many. There were always too many. For every creature they killed, 2 more took its place. For every step they pushed the darkness back, it surged forward again, hungrier, stronger, more determined to consume them all. Jae-Hyun fought until his arms ached and his lungs burned and his monarch's blood screamed for him to stop, to rest, to let someone else carry the weight for a while. But there was no one else. There was only him. There was only the F-rank who had walked into hell mode and come back with the power to change the world. He was the monarch. He was the one who had cleared hell mode. He was the weakest student in the academy who had become the strongest thing the world had ever produced. And he was not going to let the darkness win. He raised his blade, and the light that was burning in him exploded outward, a wave of silver fire that swept across the battlefield, consuming the shadow creatures, pushing back the darkness, giving light to a world that had almost forgotten what light was. The Watchers screamed, a sound that was not pain but something else, something that might have been surprise or might have been fear, and for a moment, just a moment, the tide of battle turned. It was then that the collector moved. She crossed the battlefield in a single stride, her form shifting, changing, becoming something that Jae-Hyun's mind could barely comprehend. She was no longer the figure of shadow and starlight that had led the Watcher's army. She was something older, something that had been waiting for this moment since before the first monarch was born, something that had collected worlds and civilizations and species beyond counting. She was the collector, and she had come to collect him. "Kang Jae-Hyun," she said, and her voice was the voice of the void, the voice of the space between stars, the voice of something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "You have fought well, better than any of the others, better than the first monarch, better than any creature I have collected in 1 billion years." She reached out and her hand was not a hand but a suggestion of a hand, a memory of a hand, the echo of something that had once been human before it had become something else. But the battle is over. Your students are falling. Your walls are breaking. Your world is dying. And you are alone. She smiled, and it was the smile of something that had never lost, that had never failed, that had never been denied what it wanted. It is time to be collected. Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the collector who had waited a billion years for this moment, at the ancient thing that had collected worlds and civilizations and species beyond counting, and he felt something that surprised him. Not fear, not despair, not the cold, calculating focus that had carried him through hell mode and the trials and everything else that had been thrown at him. Hoping. You're wrong, he said, and his voice was not the voice of a monarch, not the voice of a warrior, not the voice of someone who had been forged in the heart of a crucible that should have killed him. It was the voice of a boy who had been told he was nothing, who had walked into hell because he had nothing left to lose, who had found something worth fighting for in the darkness. I am not alone. The light that exploded from his blade was not the light of the monarch's power, not the light of the first monarch's legacy, not the light of anything that had ever existed in this world or any other. It was the light of a world that had refused to break. It was the light of a species that had refused to bow. It was the light of a boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided to become everything. And in that light, Jae-Hyun saw the collector's face for the first time. It was not the face of a monster. It was not the face of a king. It was the face of something that had once been human, something that had once been a girl with dreams of stars and wonders, something that had been collected a billion years ago and had been collecting ever since, trying to fill the emptiness that had been left behind. He saw her and he understood. You were like me, he said, and his voice was gentle, almost kind, the voice of someone who was about to tell a truth that the other did not want to hear. You were someone who had nothing. Someone who was collected because you were weak, because you were worthless, because no one would notice if you disappeared. And you have been collecting ever since, trying to fill the emptiness that was left behind, trying to become something that no one could ever collect again. He stepped forward and the collector stepped back, her form flickering, her face shifting, her eyes reflecting a fear that she had not felt in a billion years. But you don't have to be empty, he said. You don't have to collect, you don't have to consume, you can stop, you can rest, you can come home. He reached out his hand, the same hand that had reached for Yoo-na in the storage room, the same hand that had reached for the first monarch in the depths of the sea, the same hand that had reached for Jin Sung-ho's phantom in the hidden floor. You can be collected by something that will not take anything from you. You can be collected by hope. The collector stared at his hand, at the light that was burning in it, at the emptiness that had been gnawing at her soul for a billion years. She reached out, her hand trembling, her form flickering, her face shifting between a billion faces that she had worn and discarded and forgotten. And then, for the first time in a billion years, the collector smiled. Not the smile of a predator, not the smile of a collector, not the smile of something that had never lost, that had never failed, that had never been denied what it wanted. The smile of a girl who had been lost for a very long time and had finally found her way home. She took his hand. The light that exploded from her was brighter than the sun, brighter than the stars, brighter than anything that had ever existed in this world or any other. It consumed the watchers, consumed the shadow creatures, consumed the darkness that had been gathering for a billion years. It swept across the battlefield, across the academy, across the world, pushing back the void, giving light to a universe that had almost forgotten what light was. And when it was over, when the darkness had been driven back and the watchers had been scattered and the collector had been freed, Jae-Hyun stood alone in the courtyard of Ars Magna, his blade at his side, his monarch's crown fading, his body trembling with exhaustion. Around him, his students were rising, his professors were standing, his world was healing. They had won. Yoo-na found him at the edge of the courtyard, sitting on the same stone wall where they had watched the stars the night before, watching the sun rise over a world that had almost been lost. Her face was streaked with soot and blood, her uniform torn, her flames reduced to a faint glow around her finger, but she was alive. They were all alive. You did it, she said, sitting beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. You saved us. Jae-Hyun looked at the sun rising over Ars Magna, at the world that was healing, at the future that was waiting for them. He thought about the collector, about the girl who had been lost for 1 billion years, and had finally found her way home. He thought about the watchers, scattered but not destroyed, waiting in the darkness for another chance to collect a world that had dared to resist them. He thought about himself, Kang Jae-Hyun, the F-rank, the failure, the boy who had walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose and walked out with the power to change the world. "We saved us," he said, "all of us together." Yoo-na smiled, and it was the smile of the Crimson Princess, the woman who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood and steel in her spine. Together, they sat in silence, watching the sun rise, watching the world heal, watching the darkness retreat. The war was not over. The watchers would return. The collectors would come again. There would always be another enemy, another battle, another trial that would test them in ways they could not imagine. But they were ready. They had always been ready. And as the sun rose over Ars Magna Academy, Kang Jae-Hyun, the weakest student in the History Academy, the F-rank who had cleared hell mode, the monarch who had returned from the dead to save a world that had forgotten him, closed his eyes and let himself rest. Tomorrow there would be another battle. Tomorrow there would be another trial. Tomorrow the darkness would return. But today there was the sun. There was Yoo-na. There was a world that was healing and a future that was waiting and a boy who had become something that no one had ever expected. Today there was hope. The silence after the battle was heavier than the war itself. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of the grand hall, the same hall where he had faced the Parasitic King, the same hall where the collector had first spoken to, the same hall that had been rebuilt and broken, and rebuilt again so many times that the stones themselves seemed to remember every scar. The morning light streamed through the new dome, golden and warm, but it could not reach the shadows that lingered at the edges of the room. The watchers had been driven back, but they had not been destroyed. The collector had been freed, but her army had scattered like seeds on the wind, and somewhere in the void between worlds, they were regrouping. The system had been silent since the battle. No notifications, no warning, no quests. It was as if the ancient interface that had guided him since hell mode was waiting, watching, seeing what he would do next. But Jae-Hyun did not need the system to tell him what he already knew. The watchers were not defeated. They were merely wounded, and wounded predators were the most dangerous kind. Yoo-na stood beside him, her hand resting on the pommel of her blade, her eyes scanning the hall as if she expected the shadows to rise up and strike at any moment. Her flames had dimmed to a faint glow, the silver fire that had consumed the Watcher's army reduced to ember, but the steel in her spine had not softened. She had fought beside him through hell mode and the void and the battle that had nearly ended their world, and she was still standing. She was always still standing. "The survivors are accounted for," she said, her voice low, careful. 23 students dead, 7 professors, 112 wounded. The walls will need to be rebuilt. The wards will need to be strengthened. She stopped, her jaw tightening. "The families will need to be told." Jae-Hyun closed his eyes. 23 students. He had known some of them, trained with, fought beside them. They had been children, most of them, younger than him, younger than Yoo-na, young enough that they should have been worrying about exams and rankings and the ordinary concerns of academy life. Instead, they had died fighting a war they had never asked to be part of, against an enemy they had never known existed. "We will honor them," he said, and his voice was steady, but he could hear the weight beneath it, the guilt that he would carry for the rest of his life. "We will build something that remembers them, something that ensures that their sacrifice was not in vain." Yoo-na reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. "You saved thousands. Without you, there would be no survivors. There would be no academy. There would be no world. You did not fail them, Jae-Hyun. You gave them a chance. That is more than anyone else could have done." He opened his eyes and looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him when everyone else had turned away, who had walked into hell because she believed in him, who had fought the darkness and refused to break. "It doesn't feel like enough." She squeezed his hand. "It never does, that's why we keep fighting." The council that gathered that afternoon was the largest Jae-Hyun had ever seen. The grand hall was filled with professors, students, representatives from the noble houses that had survived the festival, envoys from the kingdoms that had sent their children to Ars Magna and were only now learning the truth of what the Academy had been hiding for 1,000 years. They had come to hear what he had to say. They had come to demand answers. They had come to decide what happened next. Jae-Hyun stood at the center of it all, his monarch's mark hidden beneath his uniform, his blade sheathed at his side, his face calm despite the storm of voices that surrounded him. He had faced the Parasitic King. He had faced the Watchers. He had faced the Collector and the Void and the end of everything he had ever known. He was not afraid of a room full of politicians, but he was tired, so very tired. "The Watchers are not he said, and his voice carried across the hall, cutting through the murmurs and the arguments and the fear that hung in the air like smoke. They are scattered, but they are not destroyed. They are regrouping in the void, gathering their strength, waiting for the moment when they can strike again. And when they do, they will not come alone." A noble from the eastern provinces stood, his face red with anger, his hands shaking. "You expect us to believe that there are more of them, more of these, things that tried to destroy us. We have lost hundreds, thousands. Our children are dead. Our walls are broken. Our world is bleeding. And you tell us that the war is not over." Jae-Hyun met his eyes, and for a moment, the noble saw something in the F-rank's gaze that made him step back, that made his anger falter, that made him remember that the boy standing before him had walked through hell and returned with the power to remake the world. "The war has not even begun," Jae-Hyun said, and his voice was the voice of a monarch now, certain and calm, carrying the weight of everything that had come before and everything that would come after. "What you saw was a scouting party, a test. The Watchers sent their servants to see what we were capable of, to measure our strength, to find our weaknesses. And now that they know, they will return with armies beyond anything you can imagine. They will come with weapons that have collected worlds since before the first star was born. They will come with hunger that has never been satisfied and patience that has never been exhausted." He looked around the hall at the faces of the people who were looking to him for answers, for hope, for something to believe in. "But they will also come with fear, because for the first time in 1,000,000,000 years, they have encountered something they cannot collect. They have encountered a world that refused to break, a species that refused to bow, a boy who was told he was nothing and decided to become everything." He stepped forward, and the light that burned in his monarch's blood flickered at the edges of his form, a halo of silver fire that made the shadows in the hall retreat. "We will rebuild our walls. We will strengthen our wards. We will train our armies. We will prepare for the war that is coming. And when the Watchers return, we will show them that the weakest student in the Academy is the most dangerous thing they have ever faced." The hall was silent. The nobles, the professors, the students, the envoys, all of them were staring at him with eyes that held something he had never seen before. Not fear, not awe, not the desperate hope that someone would save them. Respect. The Eastern noble lowered his eyes, his anger spent, his resistance broken. "What would you have us do?" Jae-Hyun smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had finally found his purpose. "Fight." The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Jae-Hyun worked with the professors to rebuild the wards that had protected the Academy for 1,000 years, strengthening them, reshaping them, making them something that the Watchers had never seen before. He worked with the students to train them in the techniques he had learned in Hell Mode, the skills that had allowed him to survive when survival had seemed impossible. He worked with the nobles to gather resources, to build alliances, to create an army that could stand against the darkness that was gathering in the void. And at night, when the Academy was quiet and the stars were bright and the world was sleeping, he sat on the cliffs overlooking the sea and watched the horizon, waiting for the enemy that he knew would come. Yoo-na was always beside him. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had said everything that needed to be said in the training yard and the library and the storage room where it had all begun. They were warriors. They were soldiers. They were the only thing standing between their world and the darkness that was waiting to consume it. And they were ready. The first sign that the Watchers were returning came on the 7th night. Jae-Hyun was standing on the cliffs watching the stars when he felt it, a ripple in the fabric of reality, a disturbance in the void, a presence that should not be there. His monarch's senses flared, reaching out, touching the darkness that was gathering at the edge of the world, and he saw them. The Watchers had returned. They were not the same as before. The Collector's army had been a scouting party, a test, a probe sent to measure the strength of the world that had dared to resist them. These were something else. These were warriors, soldiers, hunters who had been collecting worlds since before humanity had learned to walk upright. Their forms were vast, larger than the mountain, larger than the sky, their bodies made of shadow and starlight and the accumulated hunger of 1 billion years of consumption. And they were coming. Yoo-na appeared beside him, her flames already blazing, her blade already drawn. She had felt it too. They all had. The students in the academy were gathering, their weapons ready, their faces pale with fear that had become as familiar as breathing. The professors were at the walls, their spells already forming, their wills already bent to the purpose that had been forced upon them. "How many?" Yoo-na asked, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the darkness that was gathering on the horizon. Jae-Hyun's monarch's senses reached out, counting the presences that were even now crossing the barrier between dimensions. There were more than before, many more, hundreds, thousands. An army that had been gathering for 1 billion years, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. "All of them," he said, "they're sending everything." He turned to face her, and for a moment he let himself see her. Not the Crimson Princess, not the warrior who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood. Just Yoo-na, the girl who had taken his hand in a storage room and promised to stand beside him, the woman who had become the only thing in this world that he could not live without. "If we do not survive this," he began, but she cut him off with a look that could have melted stone. "We will survive," she said, and her voice was fierce, certain, the voice of someone who had never lost a battle that mattered. "We have survived everything they have thrown at us. We have survived hell mode and the festival and the void. We will survive this, together." She reached out and took his hand, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the fire that burned in her blood, the love that had grown between them in the darkness and the light. "Together," she said again, and this time it was not a promise. It was a fact, a truth, a certainty that nothing in the universe could change. Jae-Hyun squeezed her hand, and for a moment, the fear that had been gnawing at his heart since the Collector first spoke to him faded. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And as long as Yoo-na was beside him, as long as the fire burned in her blood and the steel in her spine, he would never be alone. He turned to face the darkness that was gathering on the horizon, and he smiled. Together, the Watcher's army reached the walls of Ars Magna at midnight. They came not as shadows or whispers, but as a wave of darkness that blotted out the stars, that swallowed the moon, that made the world itself seem small and fragile and utterly alone. They were not the servants that had come before. These were the hunters, the collectors, the ones who had been doing this since before the first monarch was born. Their forms were vast, their weapons ancient, their hunger infinite. And at their head, leading them, was something that Jae-Hyun had not expected. It was a monarch, or rather, it had been a monarch once, 1,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 1 billion years ago. It was impossible to tell. Its form was human, or almost human, its face a mask of shadow and light, its eyes burning with the cold, distant fire of a star that had died long before this world was born. It wore the armor of a king, the crown of a ruler, the chains of something that had been collected and broken, and remade into a weapon that had been hunting for longer than Jae-Hyun could imagine. "King Jae-Hyun," it said, and its voice was the voice of 1,000 monarchs, 1,000 kings, 1,000 heroes who had been collected and consumed and turned into tools of the Watcher's endless hunger. "The anomaly, the aberration, the one who freed the Collector and scattered our army. We have come to collect you." It raised its hand, and the army behind it surged forward, a wave of shadow and starlight that swept toward the walls of Ars Magna like the tide rising to swallow the shore. Jae-Hyun did not move. He stood at the gates of the academy, Yoo-na beside him, his blade in his hand, his monarch's crown blazing above his head, and he watched the darkness come. He had been waiting for this moment since the day he walked out of hell mode. He had been preparing for it since the moment the first monarch had shown him the truth of what was coming. He had been dreaming of it since the night he had stood on the cliffs with Yoo-na and watched the stars go out. He was ready. He raised his blade, and the light that was burning in him exploded outward, a wave of silver fire that swept across the battlefield, consuming the shadow creatures, pushing back the darkness, giving light to a world that had almost forgotten what light was. The watchers screamed, a sound that was not pain but something else, something that might have been surprise or might have been fear. And for a moment, just a moment, the tide of battle turned. And then the fallen monarch moved. It crossed the battlefield in a single stride, its blade already swinging, its eyes already fixed on Jae-Hyun's heart. It was faster than anything he had ever faced, stronger than anything he had ever imagined, its power the accumulated strength of 1,000 monarchs who had been collected, consumed, and turned into weapons for the Watcher's endless war. Jae-Hyun met its blade with his own, and the impact shook the ground, shattered the walls, sent students and professors flying. He held barely, his arms screaming, his monarch's blood burning, his will refusing to break. "You are strong," the fallen monarch said, and its voice was not its own. It was the voice of the Watchers, the hunger, the endless, patient hunger that had been consuming worlds since before the first star was born. Stronger than the others, stronger than the first monarch, stronger than any creature we have collected in 1,000,000,000 years. It pressed harder and Jae-Hyun's knees buckled, his blade trembling, his arms shaking. "But you are still just a mortal, still just a boy who walked into hell because he had nothing left to lose. And we have collected 1,000 mortal, 1,000 monarchs, 1,000 boys who thought they could fight the darkness and win." It smiled, and its smile was the smile of something that had never lost, that had never failed, that had never been denied what it wanted. "You will be no different." Jae-Hyun looked into its eyes, into the eyes of 1,000 monarchs who had been collected and consumed and forgotten, and he saw something that made his heart stop. He saw himself, the same eyes, the same determination, the same refusal to accept that there were limits to what he could do, the same hope that had carried him through hell mode and the void and everything else that had been thrown at him. And he saw, in the darkness behind those eyes, the thing that had taken them, the hunger, the endless, patient hunger that had been waiting for this moment since before the first star was born. And he understood. "You are not a monarch," he said, and his voice was not the voice of a warrior or a king or a hero. It was the voice of a boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided to become everything. "You are a memory, a ghost, a tool that the Watchers use to collect the worlds that they are too afraid to face themselves." He pushed back and the fallen monarch stumbled, its eyes widening, its form flickering. "You are afraid," Jae-Hyun said, and his voice was growing stronger now, the monarch's power flowing through him like a river, like an ocean, like the fire that was burning in Yoo-na's veins and the hope that was burning in the hearts of everyone who had survived the Festival of Stars. "You have always been afraid. That is why you collect. That is why you consume. That is why you have been doing this for 1,000,000,000 years. Because you are afraid of what happens when a world learns to fight back, when a species learns to hope, when a boy who was told he was nothing decides to become everything." He raised his blade, and the light that was burning in him was brighter than the sun, brighter than the stars, brighter than anything that had ever existed in this world or any other. "You are afraid of me." He struck, and the fallen monarch shattered. The light that exploded from it was not the light of destruction or consumption, or the endless hunger that had been gnawing at the universe since before the first star was born. It was the light of 1,000 monarchs who had been collected and consumed and forgotten, finally freed from the chains that had bound them for 1,000,000,000 years. It was the light of 1,000 worlds that had been collected and consumed and forgotten, finally remembered. It was the light of hope, of courage, of the refusal to accept that there were limits to what could be done. And in that light, the Watcher's army crumbled. The shadow creatures dissolved. The darkness that had been gathering for 1,000,000,000 years retreated, pushed back by something that it had never encountered before, something that it had never understood, something that it had never been able to collect. Hoping. When the light faded, Jae-Hyun stood alone on the battlefield, his blade at his side, his monarch's crown fading, his body trembling with exhaustion. Around him, the students and professors and soldiers who had fought beside him were rising, their faces streaked with soot and blood, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had won. Yoo-na was beside him in an instant, her arms around him, her flames flickering against his skin, her heart beating against his chest. "You did it," she whispered, and her voice was thick with tears that she had been holding back for too long. "You saved us, again." Jae-Hyun held her, feeling the warmth of her body, the fire that burned in her blood, the love that had grown between them in the darkness and the light. He thought about the fallen monarch, about the 1,000 monarchs who had been collected and consumed and forgotten, about the 1,000 worlds that had been lost because no one had been strong enough to fight the darkness. He thought about the Watchers, scattered again, wounded again, but not destroyed. They would return. They would always return. The hunger that drove them was endless, and the patience that had sustained them for 1 billion years was not exhausted. But he was not afraid. He had faced the darkness and won. He had faced the end of everything and refused to blink. He had become something that the Watchers had never seen before, something that they could never understand, something that they would never, ever collect. He was Kang Jae-Hyun. He was the weakest student in the academy. He was the monarch who had cleared hell mode. He was the boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided to become everything. And he was just getting started. The void was not empty. Jae-Hyun had always imagined it as a vast, silent nothingness, a blank canvas upon which the Watchers painted their hunger and their patience and their endless, consuming war. But standing at the threshold of the rift, with Yoo-na beside him and the remnants of the Watchers' army scattered like ash on the wind, he understood that the void was anything but empty. It was full of the echoes of 1 billion worlds that had been collected and consumed and forgotten, full of the whispers of 1 billion species that had looked at the darkness and tried to fight and failed, full of the ghosts of 1 billion monarchs who had stood where he stood now, who had looked into the heart of the void and seen the face of something that should not exist. They had all failed, every one of them. The first monarch had failed. Jin Sung-ho had failed. 1,000 heroes, 1,000 kings, 1,000 boys who had walked into hell with nothing left to lose had stood at this threshold and looked into the darkness and found something that even hope could not overcome. But they had not had Yoo-na. They had not had the Crimson Princess, the woman who had walked through hell and come back with fire in her blood and steel in her spine. They had not had the students who had rebuilt their academy from the ashes of 1,000 years of corruption, the professors who had learned to see again, the ordinary people who had looked at the end of the world and decided that they would rather die than let it win. They had not had hope. The rift is unstable, Yoo-na said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on the tear in reality that hung before them like a wound that would never heal. It pulsed with a light that was not light, a darkness that was not darkness, a rhythm that was not quite random, not quite intentional. The first monarch's journal said that entering the void without a guide is death. The Watchers have been collecting worlds for 1 billion years. They have had time to prepare, time to build, time to make this place into something that no mortal can survive. Jae-Hyun looked at the rift, at the darkness that was waiting beyond it, at the whispers that were already beginning to call his name. He had heard those whispers before, in hell mode in the catacombs, in the moments between sleeping and waking when the world was soft and the walls between realities were thin. They were the voices of the collected, the consumed, the forgotten. They were the voices of 1 billion souls who had been taken by the Watchers and remade into tools for their endless war. And they were calling to him, Kang Jae-Hyun. The voice came from behind him, soft and familiar, and he turned to see Professor Min standing at the edge of the assembly, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had been one of the first to join his army, one of the first to admit that she had been blind, one of the first to offer her life for a world she had failed to protect. She was not a warrior. She was a scholar, a teacher, a woman who had spent her life in libraries and lecture halls, never imagining that she would one day stand at the threshold of the end of everything. But she was standing. They were all standing. "We have prepared as much as we can," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hands, stronger than her feet. "The wards are in place. The armies are ready. If the Watchers try to breach the rift while you are inside, we will hold them. We will hold them for as long as it takes." She stepped forward, and for a moment she was not the professor who had stripped Jae-Hyun of his dormitory privilege, who had dismissed him as a failure, who had looked at the weakest student in the academy and seen nothing worth saving. She was something else, something that had been forged in the crucible of the Watchers' first assault, something that had been tempered by the loss of students she had taught, children she had watched grow, lives she had failed to protect. "Bring them back," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "Bring them all back, the ones we lost, the ones they took. Bring them home." Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the guilt and the grief and the desperate hope that she was carrying, and he nodded. "I will." He turned back to the rift, and Yoo-na moved beside him, her hand finding his, her fingers warm against his skin. He felt the fire that burned in her blood, the steel in her spine, the love that had grown between them in the darkness and the light. He felt the weight of everything they had lost, everything they had sacrificed, everything they were about to risk. And he stepped through the rift. The void was not what he expected. He had imagined a place of darkness and cold, of silence and hunger, of the endless patient waiting that had consumed the Watchers for 1 billion years. But the void was not empty, and it was not silent. It was full of light, 1,000,000,000 lights, each one a world that had been collected, a civilization that had been consumed, a species that had been forgotten. They hung in the darkness like stars, like memories, like the ghosts of everything that had ever been lost. And between them, moving through the void like sharks through water, were the Watchers. They were not the soldiers he had faced in the battle for Ars Magna. Those had been tools, weapons, the instruments of the Watchers' endless hunger. These were something else. These were the hunters themselves. Their forms were vast, larger than worlds, larger than suns, their bodies made of shadow and starlight and the accumulated hunger of 1 billion years of consumption. They moved slowly, deliberately, with the patience of something that had never been denied, had never been afraid. But they were afraid now. He could feel it. The fear radiated from them like heat from a dying star, a desperation that they had never felt before, a hunger that had turned from consumption to survival. They had encountered something they could not collect, a world that would not break, a species that would not bow, a boy who had been told he was nothing and had decided to become everything, and they did not know what to do. The heart of the void, Yoo-na breathed, and he followed her gaze to the center of the darkness, where the lights converged, where the worlds that had been collected hung like fruit on a tree, where something vast and ancient and terrible was waiting. It was not a Watcher. It was something older, something that had been here before the first Watcher was born, before the first world was collected, before the first star lit the darkness. It was the hunger itself, the endless, patient hunger that had been gnawing at the universe since before time began. It had no form that human eyes could perceive, no shape that human minds could comprehend. It was a presence, a weight, a pressure that pressed against Jae-Hyun's soul like the weight of 1 billion years of waiting. And it was awake. Kang Jae-Hyun. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the lights and the darkness and the space between, from the worlds that had been collected and the souls that had been consumed and the hunger that had been waiting for this moment since before the first star was born. The anomaly, the aberration, the one who should not exist. The presence moved and the void trembled. The lights flickered, the worlds that had been collected shifting, changing, becoming something that Jae-Hyun could almost recognize. Faces. 1 billion faces looking at him, waiting for him, hoping that he would be the one who finally did what none of them could do. "You have come to end us," the hunger said, and it was not a question. "You have come to free the worlds we have collected. You have come to bring hope to a universe that has forgotten what hope is." It moved closer, and Jae-Hyun felt its weight pressing against him, against Yoo-na, against everything they had ever been and ever would be. "You cannot. We have been here since before the first star was born. We will be here long after the last star dies. We are the hunger that consumes all things. We are the patience that outlasts all things. We are the end of everything." It reached for him, and Jae-Hyun saw his life flash before his eyes. Not the life he had lived, but the life he could have lived. A life without the seal, without the F-rank, without the 3 years of humiliation that had forged him into something the Watchers had never seen before. A life of power and respect, and the easy path that had been denied to him since the day he was born. And he saw himself taking that path. He saw himself becoming a monarch, yes, but not the monarch he had become. A monarch who collected, who consumed, who took what he wanted because he was strong enough to take it. A monarch who was no different from the Watchers, who had looked at the darkness and become part of it, who had been collected because he had not known how to hope. He saw the hunger reaching for him, and he saw himself reaching back. "No." The word came from Yoo-na, and it was not a word. It was a fire that burned brighter than the lights of 1 billion collected worlds, brighter than the hunger that had been waiting since before the first star was born, brighter than anything that had ever existed in this universe or any other. It was the fire of a woman who had walked through hell and come back with steel in her spine and love in her heart. It was the fire of a world that had refused to break. It was the fire of hope. "You cannot have him," she said, and her voice was not the voice of a warrior or a king or a hero. It was the voice of a woman who had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, something worth living for. "You cannot have any of them. The worlds you collected, the souls you consumed, the dreams you stole, they are not yours. They have never been yours. You are the hunger, yes. You are the patience, yes. You are the end of everything that has ever existed and everything that ever will." She stepped forward and her flames erupted, a pillar of silver fire that pushed back the darkness, that lit the void, that showed the hunger what it meant to face something that was not afraid. "But you are not the end of us. You are not the end of hope. You are not the end of a boy who was told he was nothing and decided to become everything." She raised her hand, and the fire that was burning in her exploded outward, a wave of light that swept across the void, touching the worlds that had been collected, freeing the souls that had been consumed, giving hope to a universe that had forgotten what hope was. And in that light, Jae-Hyun saw them, the first monarch who had waited 1,000 years for this moment. Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone because he did not know how to trust. The 1,000 monarchs who had stood where he stood now, who had looked into the heart of the void and seen the face of something that should not exist. The billion souls who had been collected and consumed and forgotten. They were all there, waiting for, hopping for him, believing that he would be the one who finally did what none of them could do. And he did not let them down. He raised his blade, and the light that was burning in him was brighter than the sun, brighter than the stars, brighter than the fire that was burning in Yoo-na's veins. It was the light of 1,000,000,000 worlds that had been collected, consumed, and forgotten, finally remembered. It was the light of 1,000,000,000 souls who had been taken by the darkness, finally freed. It was the light of hope, of courage, of the refusal to accept that there were limits to what could be done. And he struck. The hunger screamed. It was a sound that had never been heard in this universe, a sound that had been waiting for 1,000,000,000 years to be made, a sound that was not pain or fear or despair, but something else, something that might have been relief. And then it was gone. The void collapsed. The worlds that had been collected scattered like seeds on the wind, returning to the places they had been taken from, to the times they had been stolen from, to the lives that had been interrupted by a hunger that had finally been ended. The souls that had been consumed rose like smoke, like light, like the first stars being born, and they were free. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of it all, his blade at his side, his monarch's crown fatting, his body trembling with exhaustion. Yoo-na was beside him, her hand in his, her flames reduced to a faint glow, her face streaked with tears that she had been holding back for too long. They had won. When they stepped through the rift, the sun was rising over Ars Magna Academy. The world was not the same as they had left it. The walls that had been broken were being rebuilt. The wards that had been shattered were being strengthened. The students who had died were being mourned, and the students who had survived were being celebrated. But it was the same world, the world they had fought for, the world they had bled for, the world they had saved. Professor Min was waiting for them at the gates, her face pale, her hands trembling, her eyes wet with tears that she did not try to hide. "You brought them back," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You brought them all back." Jae-Hyun looked at the rift behind him, at the light that was fading, at the darkness that was retreating. He thought about the worlds that had been collected, the souls that had been consumed, the hunger that had been ended. He thought about the first monarch who had waited 1,000 years for this moment. He thought about Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone because he did not know how to trust. He thought about himself, Kang Jae-Hyun, the F-rank, the failure, the boy who had walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose and walked out with the power to change the world. "We brought them home," he said, and he smiled. Yoo-na leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her hand in his, her flames flickering against his skin. "What happens now?" she asked, and her voice was soft, tired, but not afraid. Jae-Hyun looked at the sun rising over Ars Magna, at the world that was healing, at the future that was waiting for them. He thought about the battles they had fought, the losses they had suffered, the victories they had won. He thought about the long road ahead, the rebuilding, the healing, the work of making a world that would never again be collected by the darkness. He thought about hope. Now he said, "We live."